Hello and welcome to the STEAM Cafe. I am your host, Jillian Rhodes, and I am here every Monday now with a delicious cocktail of science-infused art, or rather art-infused science, depending on how you look at it and how you order. This is the first episode of our new STEAM Cafe. We did a soft launch last week, but who's counting? Today is the real proper launch of STEAM Cafe, and I'm so excited. I've been doing this show for about a year now, and every week bringing you something new, maybe a new guest, maybe a rabbit hole of research into some new art science thing, and sometimes performing because that's what I do. I'm a dancer choreographer by profession. I'm based here in Pakistan. Doing a bunch of different stuff. If you're interested to see a little bit more of my work, check out my website at jillianrhodes.com. But for the moment, don't do that now. For the moment, I am here today with fascinating guests as usual, talking today about poetry and games and science and all of the interesting ways that these three seemingly different things can work together in fascinating ways. So thank you for joining me today, Sam. It's lovely to have you.
Thanks, Gillian. Absolutely delighted to be here. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, so we'll just kind of pop into it. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and who you are and what you do.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name's Sam. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University. And my background really is in science and science communication, and in particular in using poetry and games, analog games, so card games, board games, RPGs, etc., in developing dialogue between scientists and non-scientists, and in thinking about ways on how we can use this arts-based approach to help diversify science so that science becomes something that is for everybody and is a right rather than a privilege that's practiced for a few. And so, yeah, poetry and games are two ways in which we can help to engender dialogues between scientists and non-scientists and to diversify science in the process.
Interesting. That's, it just occurred to me when you were saying that, like, there's a certain crowd of people who are like into these games and gaming and card games and all stuff. And then there's like another different crowd of people who are like into poetry and like literature. And so like how did you start with these two things? Have they always been an interest?
Yeah, I guess it's because they've just always been an interest, right? So I'm obviously British. And so obviously, as like a pained middle class child, I thought that I was the world's most misunderstood and beautiful poet at the age of 14, which was obviously not the case. And so I've written poetry since then, and I've always played games. And I think my career trajectory to date has always just been about how can I shoehorn as many things that I enjoy doing as well as science into my actual work and day-to-day life. And I guess that's been part of my journey academically as well. So using poetry and games as a way of communicating science in a one-way method, but then also really realizing how poetry and games have the most power in facilitating two-way exchanges between scientists and non-scientists. And that for me is where they're the most powerful. And it's interesting you should talk about the different audiences, right? Because we know that science has a specific or certain audience, and that a lot of scientists, or the perception of scientists, is that they look a certain way and behave a certain way, not dissimilar to how I look, which is obviously rubbish because anyone could and should be a scientist. And it's the same with poetry and games, right? There's a certain stigma or a certain stereotyping that's maybe attached to audiences that enjoy these particular pursuits, whereas actually they're both amazing expressions of creativity that can be enjoyed by everyone. So I think part of what I do is about helping not only to diversify science, but also just to demonstrate to people that, look, poetry can be for you and games can be for you and science should be for you as well. And yeah, not really looking for the Venn diagram of where those three audiences meet, but rather how that Venn diagram can explode outwards to encompass as many people as possible.
Right. And so how did you get started doing this? Like, did you start by making science games? Did you start by writing, like, or was it always in your mind that like science communication is my thing?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I always thought I was going to be an actor, like a thesp, and then it didn't quite work out. The world's obviously a poorer place for it. But then when I started researching into science communication, I started writing a blog about 6-7 years ago, where every week I read a piece of scientific research and then write it as a poem to try and communicate it to a new audience. And that is the Poetry of Science, which is available as a blog and through a podcast. But then I kind of realized like this is a great way of communicating science in a one-way direction. However, where poetry is really powerful is in developing dialogue, right? So rather than me standing on the stage reading poetry, which I do beautifully, it's how can we instead like use poetry as a way to run workshops and develop co-creation and give voice to those audiences that are maybe underheard or underserved by science. And it's really powerful, right? Because when we bring together scientists and non-scientists, we get established what I call hierarchies of intellect. So even though we know that non-scientists have loads of knowledge, expertise, lived experience that can help to develop scientific discourse, sometimes getting them to share that with scientists can be challenging because they might be like, oh, look at this professor in the room, aren't they super intelligent and I'm not?
Right.
Whereas if we write poetry together, and particularly not interested in the aesthetic quality, but the process itself, it helps to level those hierarchies for three reasons. One, it gives permission to the non-scientists that what they have to say is valuable, because you can't really correct someone on a poem.
Right, exactly.
Right. And two, it gives permission to the scientists to display pathos, to display passion. And, we're so often told as scientists, present the cold hard facts. How can you research global warming, climate change, cancer, COVID, social injustice without getting angry, annoyed, upset, like frustrated about it, right?
Right.
And then thirdly, it creates a sense of shared vulnerability in which meaningful dialogue can take place because there's a safe space. Because if you see like a learned professor stand up and read a terrible haiku, you're like, oh, hold on a second, maybe they're not that impressive after all, and we're kind of part of the same society. So writing those poems together and using that as a starting point of dialogue is a really powerful way to engender these conversations, break down these hierarchies, and help to give voice to audiences that have been denied a voice in scientific discourse.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how does it happen? Are you doing workshops? Like, how do you get these people in the same room together?
It's a really good question. So often by stealth, because normally if you say to people, hey, let's come to a poetry workshop about climate change, like it's not everybody's jam, right? And
right.
I think and you're going to reach out to a group of people who are maybe like the same, that are like, preaching to the choir kind of thing, right? So for me, what it's about is identifying specific publics, moving away from this idea that there's a general public. There is no such thing as a general public. And like, look, I talk about non-scientists, but who identifies as a non-scientist? Hi, I'm John. I'm a non-scientist. It's not who we identify with, right? Whereas if we think about all of our different identities, like, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a gamer, I'm a Christian, I'm a scientist, I'm a runner, like I'm a poet. I've got all of these different hats on. And as does everybody else, as do you. You're a teacher, you're a choreographer, you're a Twitch presenter, you're a science communicator, right? You're an expat, you're all of these different publics that you belong to.
Right.
I think working with a public and specifically an audience. So for example, I've done a lot of work with refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. But it's about going and working with charity organizations who are maybe already doing like English language classes with those groups, or already doing like cooking classes, or like civic duty classes, or whatever, working with those communities that already exist, and then being like, hey, can we like just come and talk to you about what you're interested in. And then like not being like, look, we're going to talk about environmental change. So if you dare talk any topic around environmental change, we're going to shut you down.
Right.
It's more, what things are you interested in? Let's write a poem about it. Then let's take some of those ideas. Let's discuss them with some of the experts in the room. And then let's reflect on those ideas, write another poem about it, and then continue the dialogue, ideally over several weeks. So that's kind of how it works. I mean, the key thing really is identifying those audiences, and then not guessing what topics they're interested in, but rather asking them what's pertinent and important to them as a community and as a society.
That's amazing. That's really, I think it's much more likely to have some sort of impact if you ask the people, right? And so is that kind of what your podcast is about, the poetry of science?
Not quite. I mean, so my podcast is like basically my blog, but extended a little bit. So it's much more a one-way method of communication, like dissemination, right? And like for me, dissemination is still a really important part of science communication. So we look at scientific papers, and the main audience of a scientific paper is other scientists.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can be worthy and we can be like, oh, that means there's loads of science that's really important to society that they're not seeing, which is true. But we can also go, that means there's loads of bizarre, funny, like upsetting, like happy science that people aren't seeing.
Right.
So I try to write a poem that's inspired by that research. Like, please do not look at my blog and podcast like more than 2 years ago, because the poems were very much like, I observed a correlation of 0.23 between the sand and the deep blue sea. And that's not the role of poetry, right? Whereas like the poems now, I think, are much more of a just getting people interested in it. Like, I'll give you an example, right? So there's this research this week that is just, so this group in France, basically, they were going through the archives of the Toulouse Natural History Museum, and they found this conch shell. Now, this conch shell had been discovered in the 1930s outside like a cave in the French Pyrenees. And they'd realized that it was made by prehistoric people, and it was relatively significant. But then they were like, look, we've got loads of these, whatever. And then 80 years later, someone was looking through it, and they were like, let's just have another look at this. And they looked at this conch shell, and they realized that actually there was a hole at the end of it, and there were markings on it. And maybe someone had actually built this as a musical instrument. This is 18,000 years old. And so they got a musicologist and a hornblower to make a little mouthpiece out of metal, put it in the conch shell and blow it. And it made this music of like C, C sharp, D of 18,000 years old, which was, I thought, incredible, right? Like incredible. Yeah. But it's a beautifully written paper, but maybe like the science is a little bit out there for people, right? So if you'll permit me, I've got a very short poem about this that I can just read quickly.
Please do,
so it's very short. This is called Ancient Shell Sounds. Abandoned at the mouth of your shelter, you quivered apprehensively at our approach, crying out to be held as we proclaimed the exception of your discovery, sighing wearily as we consigned you to the dusty silence of our archives. But now, when I hold you in my hands, I see the face of your purposely speckled complexion. When I lift you to my ear, I hear the sound of an ancient sea lapping at your shores. When I place you at my lips, I feel the heartbeat of your creator pulsing to my breath. I close my eyes as you call out to all that you have lost. That's it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's all right, right? But
yeah, I mean, just the imagery of it. I'm just, it's just there's that idea of, finding something which is so old and somehow thinking of the person who played this and how it's lasted all this time. Just what an incredible image.
It's amazing, and it's just the most beautiful and incredible research. And every week there's like thousands of these examples of research that's super important to society, but that also just opens up windows into like what humans are capable of in both directions. So yeah, the purpose of the blog is really as a one-way method of communication to get people to see that. And then it was from writing that blog that I'm a stand-up poet. I don't know if I'm very funny when I do poetry. I'm a spoken word artist as well. And I guess doing a lot of performancing, but having a background in facilitation and workshops, I realized, look, this is maybe a really great opportunity to start to think about how we can use poetry as a way that isn't exclusionary. And again, going back to that point I talked about earlier, a lot of the times when people say to me, Sam, all the time, and it's a really good point, like, why do you use poetry, a medium that is dominated by white old dead men, to talk and try and diversify science, a topic that is dominated by white old dead men? You make a very good point. But what I'd say to that is that I think the way that we're taught poetry, like certainly in the West, it is kind of wrong, right? And people don't like poetry, I think, because they've kind of been introduced to the wrong poetry that is irrelevant to them. And so I always talk about music as an example. I love a lot of different music, but I'm not a huge fan of Finnish death metal. Sorry, Finnish death metal fans out there. And if that's the only music I'd ever heard, I'd be like, I hate music.
Right,
and I think it's the same with poetry, right? So again, it's about working with those audiences to find poetry that speaks to them, that's written by their community, that's in their language. So a lot of the workshops I do are non-English speaking, and we get by with translators, Google Translate, head nodding, and it can be really, it's just a really great way of getting people to discover more about science, but also to kind of realize that, oh, hold on, poetry is exactly for people like me and written by people like me. And, the same with all forms of art, right? Like, I think that just sometimes with high art, you're introduced to a concept or an idea that it can be really alienating. Whereas if you take the time to think about your audience, about your public, and ask them what their needs, their experiences, their lives have been like, and then really work with them to curate poetry that's appropriate and write poetry together, it can be really, it can be really awe-inspiring for them, I think.
I think there's kind of a difference. When I think of poetry, definitely I kind of think of the dead white man crowd. But when you think of spoken word,
it's different, right?
It's very, very different. Like, because spoken word, it comes to mind. There was a Cambodian, basically a deportee who was sent back from the States to Cambodia, and he was a spoken word artist. Just the most incredible poetry. It was so powerful, and people just really respond to it. I'm just thinking, like in almost more like the hip hop. It's you call it rap.
Works really well. Right? Yeah, I mean, it worked like so. One of my best friends and my colleague Dan Simpson, who's a really talented UK-based poet. We've run a project for a number of years now called Experimental Words, and we've just started another one, which is funded by the Arts Council in the UK. And we pair together poets, but spoken word artists and scientists. And rather than being like, I want you to write a poem about their research, I want you to write do the research, then the artist will come in and draw a painting or do a dance or do some science, right? And it's so arrogant, because artists have such incredible research knowledge and brains that they can bring to that science. So what we're really interested in is exploring the liminal spaces between the two disciplines, and then trying to facilitate collaboration, so that the next time they've got a project, they're like, rather than bring the poet in at the end, let's bring them in at the start when we're establishing our research questions, right? So this is a really exciting project. We've got the kickoff meeting this week. We're basically creating a 9 or 10 track spoken word album with these 10 pairings that's just going to explore all these different topics and the relationship between science and the arts. So I'm psyched about that. And absolutely, I mean, we've done live performances of this in Chicago, all across the UK. And absolutely, the diversity of the audience and also the participants it's just very different to written poetry. So absolutely, it's a far more visibly powerful way, I think, of helping to diversify and aspirationalize, if that's a word,
Right.
science.
Yeah. Yeah. I've just, I have too many questions in my brain, so I'm just trying to sort through them. But I guess, maybe if you have like some story that comes to mind from these workshops or these things that you've done, like some
Yeah,
moment that
sure.
really stood out to you that you were just like,
I can give you,
wow.
I can give you two moments. Like, and I tried to be humble. I'll give you one moment which like demonstrates my own fallibilities, and another moment which is just cool. So we were working with this group in Bristol of young men. I mean, they identified as many things, and they were amazing people. But one of the things that they had in common was that they were asylum seekers. And we were talking to them about environmental change and writing poetry in these workshops. And they didn't really speak any English. There was like one person who like acted as a semi-translator, and we started writing poetry together, and then just exploring like, I tried to tease out what they knew about climate change and greenhouse gases. And I'd gone into that assuming that they didn't know very much at all. And actually, through writing the poetry together, it transpired that two of them were like actually climate change like graduates or like research. They had like master's degrees in climate science from the country they'd come from. Like, so for me, that was like a really powerful reminder never to under or overestimate audience or assume anything, but to get to know them first. Another example, which for me was really pertinent, was a group that we're working with in Manchester. This amazing group called TLC St. Luke's, and every Thursday they do loads of stuff, but they're basically a support group for people living with mental health needs. And every Thursday they have like a meal in this like church and invite speakers along to come and talk. And what they said, so I got invited to go and like do some of my like science poetry stuff, and I rocked up with like a PowerPoint presentation, and like within a minute I was like, this is like not the space for that at all. So we just it was amazing that we just kind of like talked and like spoke about poetry and science and read, and then we developed a relationship over time. So that then when we had this project, when we wanted to find out about what people in underrepresented groups thought about environmental change, we went to this group, and I built a trust with them so that they were willing to like, they were actually willing to come to poetry workshops about climate change, which was great. And in these workshops, we had like basically some scientists came along, and like I said, we wrote poetry, explored ideas they were interested in, talked about the science, and then spoke about some more. And one of the topics that came up was air pollution. And the area in Longsight in inner Manchester is like just off the busiest bus route in Europe. So incredibly polluted, right? But this audience didn't necessarily know that pollution was even happening. And they certainly didn't have the means to be able to move away from that area. And I remember we wrote a poem, like we were writing them, and this poem just stands in my head. It's just 5 lines that one of them wrote. I've never seen pollution, never noticed it. It's always been there, but I'm unaware of it, just breathing it in. And like for me and for the other scientists, it was just such an incredibly powerful reminder that with environmental change, like pollution, etc., and like climate change, the people that have the smallest personal impact are the people that are going to be the most affected, and it's the people who are unable to affect change. I'm in a privileged position where if I lived in a really polluted area, I'd probably be able to like look to move elsewhere, and I'd certainly know that it was going on.
Right.
Whereas I think that assumption goes on, and that was just it stands out for massively as a very powerful learning experience, and I think for the other people in the room as well.
Wow. So let's just switch tracks for a bit and talk about games for a little bit. The poetry is fast. I love poetry. I write sometimes. That's how I deal with my brain, and I write poetry. Yeah. So is the gaming stuff, does that come in kind of the same workshops, or is that kind of a different track that you're working on?
It's a different track, and again, I do most of my games work with my friend and colleague Paul Wake, who's a reader in English at Manchester Metropolitan University. And this came about because Paul and I, play a lot of games, and this it was actually a bit of a reverse way with this. We knew that games would be a really powerful way to start to have conversations and start dialogues and workshops, because when you sit down to play a game with someone, right, you engage in a series of negotiated contracts that mean that you can negotiate hierarchies that are different from those that exist away from the gaming table. So if we're playing Monopoly, like, we've sat down to agree that it's perfectly okay, indeed advisable, for me to try and bankrupt you, which is behavior that is morally repugnant away from the gaming table.
Right. Yes.
But it creates this, like, in games studies, it's called the magic circle, but it basically just creates this space in which we've negotiated contracts so difficult conversations can take place outside of hierarchies that exist away from the gaming table. And so we modified, and we basically looked at games that had like a slight sciencey theme, like things like Pandemic or Photosynthesis or Wingspan, and used these games as ways of talking to people about science and starting conversations. But again, we had massive learning things here, because I'm pretty good with science jargon, like, don't use science jargon, right? But gaming literacy is something we just hadn't thought about. So Paul and I had picked these games that were like, this game's so much fun to play, and we're like very big nerds, but like, this is such a good game to play. And then in our heads, it's like, but this is like a really complex game that takes an hour to explain, 5 hours to play, takes up an entire seminar room, is probably like $200.
Right.
That's completely alienating. So instead, can we set ourselves targets and like constraints in which we allow for the gaming literacy of our audience, people who might never have played games before?
Right.
And then that got us thinking, let's just design games, right? We love games, let's design games. So then we thought about how can we'd designed a game around global warming, and then we were basically asked by the climate charity in the UK Possible to co-create a game called Carbon City Zero. And this game was awesome, right? Because co-creation is a buzzword, but it's a really powerful way of actually working with diverse audiences. So we worked with policymakers, activists, industry experts, students, teachers, community groups, and asked them, what are the biggest challenges for becoming a net zero city? So zero carbon being emitted. And they told us this, and then we worked with a basic game mechanic, and then we play tested it with them, went back, edited, and released Carbon City Zero, vanilla version. That went out, launched on Kickstarter, did really well. Then we got feedback from people being like, Sam and Paul, this game's great. You compete as city mayors to become the world's first zero carbon city. But why are you competing against one another? Shouldn't this be like a collaborative thing? To which Paul and I literally had no answer. And the only solution was to go and redesign the game so it was collaborative, right? Which is what you see there, Carbon City Zero World Edition. But again, a great learning experience for me and for Paul in general about meaningful dialogue and co-creation isn't about box ticking. It's about listening to people who bring new thoughts and ways of looking at things, which can make whatever you're doing better. So you don't do it because diversifying is good. You do it because like everybody has a right. And also by bringing in as many people as possible, you have all these different viewpoints, all these different mindsets, all these different experiences to make what you're doing better. And this was an amazing experience. And like, again, it funded in Kickstarter last year. There's like thousands of people have got this game now. And it's available for free on a cool website called PNP Arcade, which just stands for Print and Play. So if you just Google P&P Arcade and Carbon City Zero World Edition, it comes up. You can download it, print it at home. And yeah, that's how we use games. So like a similar thing, we now what I'd say with the games is it feels a bit more joined up. So now our process is what we like to do is run workshops, use that as a way to work with people to generate ideas, and then use that to make games. So for anyone listening, if you've got like a research topic and like a little bit of money and you want it, the money doesn't get paid people for like stuff, but like that you want to make a game, like just get in contact, because it's a really cool process and it leads to a lot of like the making of the game itself is like so interesting, like even better than the actual game product, right? Which is also cool. But the conversations that take place during that co-design process are even more powerful than the conversations that take place as a result of people playing that game. And so yeah, that's a potted history kind of how the games came into being.
And how long did it take you from kind of start to, really like like is this a
Yeah,
multi-year process?
it takes a long time, right? Like, so, does, I guess, with any art, right? Like making something that is art or poetry or a game that works, maybe doesn't take that long. So like a prototype, but then running all the workshops, getting it so it's good, refining it. I mean, like I would say each iteration took the best part of a year. So this was like a 2-year project from start to finish, which is actually quite quick, really.
Yeah.
But you can't rush these things because you need to be working with the audiences, giving them meaningful, like actual time to go back and edit it or comment on it and listen to them. And it's kind of like, especially with the play testing bit, it's kind of like scientific peer review. You need to listen to everyone's opinion. I mean, you can't take every opinion on board in the design process, but you need to at least have a rebuttal as to why you've decided not to go down that particular route. And again,
Right.
something that we're just learning over and over again is when people are like, we're like, what are, like, all these people are saying X about the game. They're so wrong, aren't they? They're completely wrong. Whereas we're now like, hold on, if all these people are saying X about their game, we're the people that are wrong. And like, they're definitely the people that are right. And we need to change this about the game. So like really, again, being humble and opening up ourselves to meaningful dialogue and criticism is a really important part of that game design process.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, just the whole, the collaborative process, whatever that comes out of the game, but just that process must be fascinating and frustrating and take a lot of patience but I guess that in the end it must be really worthwhile. I let's just kind of a couple broader questions to finish up, and if anybody in the chat has questions for Sam, please do send them and we can ask. But like if you could put words to it, like what is it that art and science bring to each other, actually?
Mm. So I think for me, they're complementary disciplines, right? They're often thought of as mutually exclusive entities, whereas actually what they are is they're one piece and one piece of a massive jigsaw, which is the world and the globe and the universe. And neither of them has all of the answers or anywhere near all of the answers. But when we bring the two together, it lets us just see a little bit more around the fringes of what's there. So for me, that's what it is. And something I'm super passionate about is trying to get away from this idea of you're a poet, you're a dancer, you're a sculptor, you're a scientist. We're all human beings with infinite potential, and we should just create environments in which people can be encouraged to be that.
Fair enough. I like it. I like it. And so in the future, it could be as idealistic or realistic as you want, but how would you like to see, arts education integrated with science or science
Mm.
education integrated with the arts?
I think I think just finding opportunities where both of them can be used like alongside one another, and like seeing where one thing can lend to others, right? So I'll give you a really good example, I think. So if we look at analogies, like science uses analogies all the time, but science uses analogies that are sometimes like just completely rubbish or really inappropriate.
Right.
Like, so for example, we always talk about maps in science, right? But for me, a map is like a really alienating and politically and like geographically loaded concept, because it's something that a human has decided to imprint on people. And like many people, many communities see maps and they have issues with that for many reasons. So what I'd love to be able to see more is like however poets and artists and writers use analogies really beautifully and really carefully, because that's their like raison d'etre, part of it. So how can we utilize those skill sets to bring that into the equation? And again, like I was hinting at earlier, how can we bring artists into the scientific process right at the start rather than as an afterthought for dissemination? I mean, which there's still a role of, but how can we use that? And similarly, how in those collaborations, how can we say to the scientists, oh, you're a creative person too, like, we'd love to have your creative input in this development. So yeah, I
Right.
think that's what I'd really like to see happen.
Interesting. I've watched there's a TED talk that I was watching recently about the Dance to Your PhD competition,
Yeah.
which is basically about, like it's a proper competition where, scientists have to like transform their PhD dissertations into dance. But he did actually talk about this in this TED talk, which was like bringing artists into the lab from the beginning and, like modeling different things with dancers and this kind of stuff, which is just fascinating because I think it's a concept that, we're just not used to yet. The idea that like you bring this artist into a lab and somehow like, something progressive happens. But
So so there's a really cool quote, right? So there's a Richard Brautigan, right, who's like a really famous beat poet. He's awesome. He was poet in residence at Caltech in 1967 in the Summer of Love. And right, he's poet in residence at Caltech for 6 months. It's Caltech. Like in the 60s, everything that is science is at Caltech. And this is the poem that he wrote during his poetry in residence. I don't care how goddamn smart these guys are. I'm bored. It's been raining like hell all day long, and there's nothing to do. And that's it, right? And like you read that and you're like, oh, typical poet, takes 6 months residency and writes this poem. But then you actually peel it back and you think to yourself, if you are here, right, and doing all this stuff, and Richard Brautigan, who's one of the greatest poets of his generation, thinks that, what are you doing to, like, in terms of the communication of how you're getting people involved with science? Such a humbling lesson for me. So yeah, more people, more Brautigans, more poets in residence, but like in a way that it's like, don't just come and write about us, really get integrated into that whole process throughout.
That's very cool. I love that. It's been raining like hell and I'm bored. There's nothing to do.
Right, it's just amazing.
What a mood for 2020, right? Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
So yeah, like I say, like Dan and I've got this experimental words 2 project where we're creating this spoken word album, which I'm really excited about. I'm the founder and editor of a journal called Consilience, which is a science and poetry journal, which we set up as a way to try and create a space through which to explore science and poetry. And it's peer reviewed. It's the world's first peer reviewed poetry journal, I think, where basically, but the thing is, when you normally submit to a poetry journal, he says, speaking from bitter experience, you just tend to get either rejected, accepted, because the poem's either perfect or not. And that just doesn't make sense. So can we take some of the cool things from science where you submit work to be peer reviewed and improved upon and apply that to poetry instead? So we have a team of about 50 editors and reviewers from 6 of the 7 continents, just missing Antarctica. And people submit work to us on a quarterly basis around the theme of an issue. And we try to accept all of it. And we work with the poet to suggest revisions to improve the poem and improve it as we go along. So yeah, that's called Consilience. And I'm the founder and one of the editors of that. So that takes a lot of my time, but it's something that I enjoy a lot. And yeah, I guess just loads of other projects we're working on, like designing a few games. I constantly write my poetry. I'm writing another book. I've just finished a book about science and poetry. So yeah, quite a lot going on, I guess.
Yeah, sounds like it. Wow. There's one question from the chat. Asterwise is asking, how problematic is it to get funding for a bottom-up approach or getting organizations to care about what you're doing?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of getting funding is just hard anyway. I mean, in the UK, like science communication and public engagement definitely has more funding. And it does exist. I think what we've tried to do in the past, so we were really lucky with this Arts Council grant, is to demonstrate impact and feasibility with small scale pilot studies. You can at least kind of do for minimum like cost on lots of different people, maybe just yourself, and creating those examples that work, and then using that to frame a wider study and look for opportunities where that can take place.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Well, cool, Sam. This has just been incredible. It's been so much fun to chat, and it's just been like just fascinating. All the work you're doing. It's just very cool, and I definitely will be on your website, looking at, you know, some of the poetry and the other work that you've been doing. So thank you so much for this. Is there anything that I missed that you'd like to talk about or
I
add?
mean, no, that sounds pretty good. Thanks, Gillian. I really appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, if people want to hit me up on Twitter, I'm just at Sam Illingworth. My website is www.samillingworth.com, and I love collaborating with people from all across all different disciplines. So please just get in contact and let's make poetry and games together.
Awesome, very cool. So thanks, Sam, for joining us today. And we'll wrap up Steam Cafe for today. I'll be back next week. I'm talking to a Malaysian painter who does this incredible work on painting galaxies and stars and nebula. And she's also using I don't know how she does it, but they look different in UV light. So we'll talk to her about that. So that's coming up next week. This week, CosmoQuest is off, so your normal Daily Space Astronomy cast is not on this week, but definitely come back next week to catch all of our usual programming, the Daily Space, Astronomy cast, Weekly Space Hangout, and all of that. And I will be back next Monday at the very same time on Steam Cafe. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.